My name is Lee Immonen. I am a faculty member here in visual arts, teach sculpture and some foundation classes, and want to welcome you all here today on behalf of the department and also on behalf of the residency program, which is the Jane Stevens King Visiting Artist Program Fund that we have set up through a really generous donation from a longtime patron of the arts, Jane Stevens King, who has supported the idea of bringing artists from diverse backgrounds and perspectives to the campus in order to share and broaden our students' opportunities for engagements directly with professionals in the field, and also to have a chance to be exposed to some new ways of thinking, new ways of approaching art making and performance, and to have that direct one-on-one relationship with an artist. So that's the kind of the goal of the program. As stated, this last year has been a little bit challenging because we've been during a pandemic, and so that's made it a little bit challenging to have the type of direct relationship we would like to have with the artist. What we elected to do instead was to focus our awarding of residencies out into the local community. So we offered 6 fellowship grants or residency grants to artists of Lane County to support them in their making without any rules about what they make or restrictions on how they produce their work, with the opportunity then to bring it back to the campus after kind of a remote residency time period, then bring their work to campus and share it with us. And we're very lucky to have had a number of applicants, and we selected Melanie Hamilton, whose work is here in this gallery space and quite fantastic. To fill this space again after a long hiatus is really wonderful for us, and I know that Robin is going to introduce Melanie at length and give you a little bit more background about her work, but it is our pleasure also on behalf of the sculpture program to have you here and to see your work engage this space. It's really pretty wonderful. So thank you and welcome, welcome to Lane and to your show here.
So welcome.
Thank you.
It's super exciting to have your work in the space, like Lee said, and to have been able to work with you, Melanie, over the course of getting to know you and your work in this exhibit. And I want to welcome Andy's class. Melanie Hamilton was raised in a small rural town, Twin Falls, Idaho. I love this part. She says that her first drawing was a chicken on the kitchen wall, done in crayon at 3 years old. Throughout middle and high school, she developed competence in drawing, sculpture, and ceramics. After graduating from high school, she attended some college, got married, and then left school to focus on homemaking. After 10 years and 4 children, she began to reprioritize her art education. In 2017, she graduated with an associate's degree in visual arts from her local community college, the College of Southern Idaho, and then she and her family relocated here to Eugene. She earned her BFA in sculpture from the University of Oregon in 2021. The foundational subjects of her work are women, care, maintenance, gender roles, power, and relational dynamics. So hopefully there's some stuff brewing in your head and you can kind of read it in the work here as we continue to talk about this. So there are later, when we break and you're talking with Melanie, there are these wonderful kind of safety orange pamphlets that I really think of as this power source of the work, and they're on the pedestal there at the back. You're welcome to take one. And there's all kinds of really great information, including Melanie's bio and her artist statement. So I'm going to read Melanie's artist statement because I think it's a really good spot to start. And then Melanie's going to talk about her work, but we're going to kind of have a little bit of a conversation here. The foundational subjects of my work are women, care, maintenance, power, gender roles, and power dynamics. Melanie writes, I consider traditions, the everyday rituals, spirituality, and human object relationships within the domestic sphere or space, where most commonly women labor and mediate family dynamics. I use materials that are receptive to energy and shaping, also those which are utilitarian, ready-made, packed with their own emotional and sociocultural memories. The objects, actions, and stories of the domestic world set the stage for Melanie's work, and her methods explore the repetitive activities and gestures generated there. She writes, I reconfigure the domestic space as a place of power and surrender, textured by provisions and depletions. This exhibit, necessary at the time, combines altered ready-mades, hand-built forms to characterize the physical, emotional, and psychological labor that takes place within the domestic landscape. So you may all be thinking of your mothers and grandmothers, right? So welcome, Melanie.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you all for being an audience, and it definitely feels like I'm a step of life ahead of most of the students, but I definitely feel that there's relevancy for all audiences in the work.
Oh, absolutely. So tell us, if we could start with the title that you've chosen for the exhibit, Necessary at the Time, and printed in this really fantastic, vibrant and kind of alarming orange color.
Yeah, great. So to apply for the residency, you have to start by kind of talking about what you see your work becoming, and my work really is set on investigating how do I make the labor that takes place in the home, in the domestic space, visible? How do I manifest that physically? So I wanted to explore more than just what happens on the outside and the activities, but also what happens on the inside. And so Necessary at the Time is like doing multiple things. I think the language itself actually infers that there's a before and a during and an after, and that there's like an application of something that's new and a removal of something that becomes unnecessary. One of the things that is so amazing to me about COVID that maybe we don't hear about very often, but millions of women have left their jobs to go and be at home because COVID has necessitated that children are at home, and that the necessity of women to be free caregivers has changed that whole landscape for women. And so I definitely, I'm thinking about that and this idea of continual adaptability, and that the idea of being adaptable is kind of a feminine quality, and that it's built into that landscape as well. And then I also think like, through the research that I did, which was really kind of like, let's get down and try to understand all of the pieces and parts that constructs this world that we now live in, how we give maternal care, how we operate, the kinds of activities that we labor for. I'm thinking about like, like how did we get here? And what's actually necessary, what can stay and what needs to go. And I think the color orange is such a great reference for just like something that surprises when you see it. And then also like, you know, when you're transporting lumber, you tie something on the end so that maybe when people are driving, they don't have to totally pay attention, but they can just see it and know like, okay, I need to be careful.
Right, so this is a color that we often associate with public spaces where those gestures might be larger than those repetitive gestures that in the domestic sphere. We don't usually see this color at home, like on the corners of tables.
Right, and I think as a mother, there's things that you, like maybe you hear a child say something and it's alarming, or there's an interaction over here that's alarming. And so you almost like tie yourself to that in your mind You're going to renegotiate how that's going to go later on, maybe have a conversation. And so I think about, as a mother, that there is this like flagging system, and yeah, that's definitely, I love the idea that, especially with mothers leaving the public sphere and going back home, that there's an opportunity to like pay attention to how we move forward with that reality. Not all women will be able to return to the workforce, and how do we negotiate that? What does that mean? Yeah. There's a lot there, yeah.
So one of the notes that I have here is that you've referred to the gesture of labor. Could you describe what that means to you, what those gestures look like, and maybe where we see it in the work here?
Sure, yeah, so I think about, just the reality of raising children and having, like, my oldest is 15, my youngest is about to turn 11, and that there's these things that our parents have done for us that get embedded in our systems, and then these activities that we do over and over and over, and they actually get put inside of our bodies. And so with the forms that I'm making, I'm thinking about how, like, the plaster forms themselves, like, I have to dip them in plaster over and over again to build up these layers, and then I'm smoothing them over and over to build these certain forms. And so a Feldenkrais practitioner that I know talks about this idea about movement vocabulary, and that we become familiar with certain movements, like, let's all go home and brush our teeth with our opposing hand tonight, and you'll get what I mean, that there's this learned gesture that becomes embedded in the body, and then when we try to do it a different way, we really feel like the actual motion, the activity that we're doing in a different way. So when I'm making, there are a lot of times like that I'm like, oh my God, I'm cooking. I feel like I'm preparing a meal. And I love that the food kind of looks like, the sponge forms kind of look like food. They kind of look like a burrito or whatever. So there's a lot of ways that that shows up. So there's that familiarity. And then I'm also thinking about emotional labor, Robin, which is like, it shows up as cooking, but there's also a way that I want to describe emotional labor, which is like confronting something with your child, whether it's their experience outside of the home, and then going back to it over and over and doing that smoothing. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't stay like this sharp space inside of them, but it actually becomes something that they've learned how to navigate and develop a kind of resilience. So how else is gesture embedded in the show? I think the piece behind you, this like stack of buckets, mm-hmm. like there is nothing holding those together. They're all balanced, very, like with using gravity to hold them in place. And the anxiety that was happening inside of me as I was, putting this piece together, I'm like, oh God, this is so familiar to me as I'm really like working with a brush and trying to get the connections between the plaster objects, filling in with plaster, smoothing out with a brush. Like there's a window of time, and it requires, like, my system ramps up this anxiety, and then once the plaster is dry, I can't work on it anymore. And so that was really familiar to me too, that gesture.
Well, that's interesting because that's really different than with clay.
Right. There's a kind of patience and also just like protecting the clay itself. I told you, like, my cat climbed on after I wrapped all the sponges in clay and they were drying them, my cat decided that that was a great place to take a nap. So that kind of, just like patient, attentive care that the forms require. That's definitely part of the labor of being a mother too, so, yeah.
Right, forming, and I think, how do you distinguish motherhood from parenthood?
I don't necessarily, I can't talk about the experience of fathering, so I like to talk about parental labor as well. And I think too, there's like look at the landscape of navigating my maternal labor and the artistic labor, like there's a lot of overlap that takes place. I think for students who are studying and trying to develop their own artistic practice, that there's like tedium, like you have to move through the tedium, and I think that's in parenting and maternal labor and all of those. But I think generally, especially in a culture where we inherit patriarchy, that there is a difference between how mothers facilitate parenting and how fathers facilitate parenting. And I'm definitely all for making that really messy so that there's no distinguishing between who does what. Yeah, I'm into that.
So materials, we just started touching on materials. I loved this line from your statement. You said that materials are receptive to energy and shaping.
Yeah.
And I really see that as a metaphor in parenting. I no longer actively parent young children, they're adults now, but there is still, so many of those gestures that you're talking about, and you've described both in the work with these forms and with humans, both the physical and the emotional labor. There's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah.
So can you describe a little bit about what you mean with the materials? Because you have some unusual, what I would refer to as kind of non-precious materials, the sponge forms in particular.
Yeah. Yeah, the sponge forms themselves actually arrived trying to talk about objects, and specifically objects that typically we see in museums or in museum collections, these female figurines. And so I'm thinking about feminine energy and how these objects that we see like in a catalog of the Met's work, they're completely removed from where they actually showed up while they were in use. And so they were in the house. They were actually in people's houses, particularly in women's spaces. And it was a way for them to investigate their inheritance and their, what it means to be a female. And so we all do this with objects. We embed certain energies or memories or experiences, and then we can go back to that object and it transports us. So I was like, how do I communicate this? And then what I found was, because it's a sponge, it also talks about artistic labor, and it also talks about maternal labor. And so I found, like, wow, this is a really diverse and operative material. The sponge itself, like, its form actually communicates this idea of exchange. Like, it's porous, it's open. So it like pulls in, it pulls in and it releases. So then I'm like, well, let's see what happens. Like, let's wrap it up in clay. And then you get like my fingerprints and gloves all over it, and these like beautiful folds. And they're so breakable, which is obnoxious, but it's also really, I think it's really important that there's like some level of breakability. And then, just like having this other action that the two things are kind of melded with this plaster. It just creates almost like a housing, like it becomes an object. So I'm gonna turn over my notes that I have. So I loved that I was able to come up with something that was really material that I had made, that I could build with, that did all of this pointing as far as like maternal labor. And then I also, like, you wouldn't think that an oak dining chair is like a receptive, energetic object until you really like assess, like, what does this object really mean to me? And when I think about a dining chair that has two arms, like, I'm totally thinking about my dad. I'm thinking about my grandpa, and there's like this place at the table that belongs to a man, and this chair that also belongs to a man. And so by cutting it and taking one of its arms off, it's like opening it up and giving it, like giving myself the capacity to kind of get in there and make things messy and work with it. So Yeah, and I think too, plaster typically in sculpture is like a way to get from one object to another. It's like you use it as a vessel to create a form rather than actually creating plaster sculptures. So I'm definitely thinking about that too. Like it's so mutable, but it's so beautiful to me. I think plaster as an object is like really lovely. So yeah, as far as materials, it's like I really also just love the color of the sponges. And I tried this red clay this time, and so one of those boxes is red clay and the other one is white clay, and I love I thought it was exciting to find some new color.
I think of Louise Bourgeois when I see, and I think of nursing, and I think of udders.
Yeah.
When I see these repeated cells, almost, but they really change when they're enclosed.
Yeah.
So what's the relationship between those objects and this object or form?
Well, I knew starting out, as far as process, it's like I knew starting out I had this chair and I wanted to work with this chair, and I had built some boxes out of pine and had another work that I had done where the sponges were cut to like this big, and then I stacked them inside of this larger box. So I was like, I'm gonna do that again, but totally fill the objects and just see what happens. But I couldn't get this oak dining chair and these new pine boxes to actually like talk to each other. This is a pretty old chair. The material, like the grain is really closed. And the pine is like, it's like a baby. So I couldn't get them to work, and I was really frustrated about it. I built more boxes out of a different kind of wood, and then I finally found those sewing drawers and a desk that was thrown in the Fred Meyer parking lot, and I was like, this is exactly what I've needed. And so here we are, like between the space of like seated and opening, like reaching out to open a drawer, and all of this process is taking place. And when I think about those, I really just was using them as like a formal exploration. And then also they kind of became this idea of inheritance. Like what do I do as a parent that I don't need to be doing necessarily, that I'm doing just because my mom did it? And what was my mom doing that just like she does it because my grandma did it? And just like that to me is like, you can't actually open and close the drawers anymore. And everything's all kind of stuck together. I can't actually know what my mom's experience was. And it's messy even to pull apart mine. But there's a little more clarity around what I'm doing. So I definitely think about these over here as like that inherited meaning, and then this is kind of like pulling it apart and navigating what I'm doing as a parent and as an artist too. So, yeah, is that helpful?
Yeah.
Cool.
Let's see. So we've touched on process, materials, and now let's move to concept. And you've spoken.
Yeah.
To that. So you talked a lot about parenting, mothering today, but in other conversations that we've had, and there was something when we talked a couple of weeks ago that what the note that I made was, is there celebration in the work too? Because there are all of these references to the repetition of gender, the repetition of gesture, and there's some mundane qualities there.
Yeah.
Necessary all the time, but it's mundane, and I think that there's also something super playful that happens here. And so it's a muddled question, but is there, I mean, you're addressing the work, and like breaking tradition or breaking rigid gender roles. But then, like, is there celebration?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think going back to the reality for a lot of moms who just left their jobs to go home and be with their kids all the time, that if you interviewed any one of them, that they would be like, oh yeah, there's like moments of pure joy amidst all of the harried chaos that hurts inside me. And so I definitely want that to be in the work. I want there to be a celebration. And I think, I think about like increased capacity, like you have no idea before you have a baby at all what it's going to be like. And then you're a completely different person. I don't want to say every single day because that feels like really cheesy, but some days you really hold on to the resistance of what your child is requiring of you. And other days it's like, okay, you can just let go and you can allow yourself to be changed and the shape of you becomes different. So I think about like increased capacity for adversity, but I also think about like resilience, like really discovering like what you're made of inside of this private space is a reality that we like all experience, but we don't necessarily put a lot of time into developing language around it. And I want to see it as a sculpture. Like I want to see how hard it is as a mom to let things go that you think are important. And I love the name of those orange things. They're called night eyes gear ties. And those are they're like the orange pieces sticking out of the back. And it's like, night eyes makes me so think about having young children, which I also don't have anymore. But also like constantly being able to just add one more thing because somebody has this need or somebody had this experience. And so you just add it to your being and you carry it with you until it's resolved. And wow, that's something to celebrate, like being able to be strong enough to also carry someone else's burdens. And I just think like it's messy to make this work. It's so messy, and it's so messy to run a house that has children and navigate all of the relationships with grace and success some days. Yeah. So yeah, I think I really like real life, that it's like mostly like monotone and there's highs and lows. Mm-hmm. And I really want to celebrate like those kind of like mediocre moments that, yeah. So I think for a lot of the work, like I want to compare artistic labor to maternal labor, and I imagine a lot of women coming home and finding this space because they don't have to work anymore, but they also have to take care of their kids. They find the space to be creative. And they develop that inside themselves and nurture it. And there's tips on the pamphlet that are also for that idea that we're in a time where maybe that becomes possible for people.
Right. I love your, so when you pick up your booklet, tips for the mother who is also an artist, and anyone else really, is in the lower right-hand corner on the back.
Anyone else really.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there are some really great, I think just really practical tips there.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I'd like to open up to questions or comments.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just get our group going here a little bit. So can you talk more specifically about the work that you have between and how, I mean, I can see some definite materials coming out into the other sculptures and into the 2D pieces as well. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that part came together within the show? Okay,
yeah. So like I said, I started with this chair. I knew I wanted to work with this chair. I came in and saw the space. As a sculptor, it's so essential to actually like know what space you're working in. And talking with Lee, the fact that this is a show at a community college, like how it's almost like, it can be like tricking people to just show finished work. that there isn't this, like there's no struggle involved, there's no showing the materials. And so what I wanted to do here was really show some of the process and some of the tools that were necessary. And I also think having it like smack in the middle of the show, like you don't get any of this unless you're really in this space all the time. So I have, yeah, like some of the stuff that's sitting here, every single thing that's sitting here is like present in the work. These braces on the ground are 3D printed braces that I actually drilled holes in each of the spindles, and this plaster piece lifts off, which is something I learned, Andy, from making a piece where the plaster doesn't come off. And try like transporting a chair that has this hard plaster on this soft chair. Oh my God, it was a nightmare. Every time I took it somewhere, then I had to fix it and repair it. So I'm like learning as I go. Also, this fits in my Tahoe, and the piece before, I had to rent a U-Haul trailer. So I'm really glad that there's like, you get to keep trying and figuring out what works. Yeah, I really wanted to show like this is how I got there. Like this is how the sponge looks before it's got any plaster on it, and this is these are the materials that I end up working with, and some of the ways that I get there, like I take this freezer paper and I make a cone out of it, like a baker who's frosting a cake, and get the plaster to a certain texture, and then I can fill in the gaps between. And so, yeah, I think I wanted to, when I'm making all of these works, I'm a new artist. I just graduated from the UO with my BFA in 2021. So I just moved from having a studio at the university to having nothing. And so that means I'm making work in my living room. And so this installation is really about like negotiating space inside my own home to take over and to navigate like, no, this is my space. I'm going to be working in here, and this mess that I'm making is important to me. I'm sorry it's frustrating to you. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yes. Cool. I also love something that happened in the work that I think is really funny, is that it's a giant phallus in the middle of my show, and like you don't get babies very often without sex, and so I love that there's this big piece, and these braces that I ended up printing look like IUDs, and I have to say, like as a student going to the University of Oregon, like this is the dynamic. I'm older than everybody. I'm the person that has all the kids. I'm like the mom. And so when I give a talk, I'm like, here's some condoms. Like that's the impulse I feel. So I stepped away and I was like, oh my God, I did it again. It just shows up. So that piece makes me laugh.
Hi. So I guess I have two questions. Did you find it really challenging having children, going to school, and working on your arts, as well as how was it returning to school, being like you're saying, the oldest person there?
Thankfully, I wasn't the oldest person there most of the time. Community college is great because you have a pretty broad range. It was really difficult to go to school and have kids. And then I also, like you all, went to school during COVID. And that meant that I was no longer able to like be at home alone most of the time. So I'm really glad that that season is over. And I don't know, maybe I will go back to school and like get a master's degree, but I'm kind of gonna wait till my kids are a little bit older. But yeah, it's tricky. Yeah, and having kids generally, it's like not a cakewalk. It's like the hardest work you'll ever do to help a person become not who you want them to be. but themselves, actually. So, and I think as an artist, like maybe that translates a little bit, because sometimes as we're working, it seems like the work actually has a different idea than we do for it. And so being receptive and allowing that to take place is so translatable into parenting. Yeah.
Thanks. Hi. I have, I think eventually a question, but I think initially maybe some comments that observational. But I can't help but look at the kind of larger pieces in the room and think about that kind of slow care that happens in building a piece like this and kind of adding slowly this kind of additive cellular process where it's these, I mean, it feels very much like honeycomb to me, like this, and also the way that bees will kind of take a space and make it their home and kind of build their comb on it, which is both like brooding area as well as like honey and resource management, right? Like, and I'm thinking about that in respect to the work that you've been doing and thinking about roles and the role of a parent, but also specifically a mother in the home and how you're in that position of care and responsibility, kind of building and maintaining. And I'm very curious how, given that you went to school during COVID and also you've been generating this body of work during COVID, the increase in urgency around care and safety at home, like, you know, that shift has happened, as well as people stepping out of the workplace. There's also been this like real need to focus on this, a much more existential threat than like just the normal everyday threat of concern of parenting, right? Like you're actually worried about their health and safety in a very different way for the family, and how that, if at all, it's played a role in the form making and the choices and the way in which your forms have developed in this body of work. Does that make sense?
I think so. I love you just taught me things about bees, which is very cool. I think what you're asking me is, you know, does COVID show up in the work or the kind of parenting that is necessary? I mean, in a way, it's not possible for it to not show up because the work got made in the space where the kids were being parented. And I think about like those orange tentacles coming off and like getting an email that someone in my kids' cohort just tested positive for COVID. And like over New Year's, a couple days before, my oldest son got exposed to somebody who had COVID. So that meant he's alone in his room through New Year's, and we're all out here having this. And that is something I have never experienced as a parent, is having to force isolate one of the kids, especially through a celebration. So I think the alarm of the orange reads pretty COVID specific sometimes, but I would say generally I also I'm trying to get to this bigger picture of what caregivers do and point to valuing it. Some of the resources on the power sheet that Robin calls it, you know, I read The Creation of Patriarchy by Gerda Lerner, and I read The Chalice and the Blade by Riane Eisler. And they really break down like the way that patriarchy functions, like how we got here, and the fact that our culture is so tuned into caregiving, and essential workers is like the phrase that we all know now that we never thought about. It's like that's actually, those are steps toward changing this like dominator patriarchy-based model to a model that values responsibility and values nurturing and values like this communal love and recognizes like we do live in this kind of cellular form where we're all touching each other and sharing this air that we breathe. So I'm definitely thinking about those concepts, but I think in maybe not so close inside COVID, but really thinking about what other women are going through because of COVID. I had already homeschooled kids. Like, I put them in public school when we moved here. And so our experience of, okay, now you have to do school at home was pretty familiar. But for a lot of people, it was really devastating. And women having to give up their jobs and renegotiate all the space in the home, that's hardcore. To me, that's hardcore, yeah. So, yeah.
So I'm really curious, and I think this is important, related to the work that students do and how they're developing their ideas. I think you mentioned a little bit about how those boxes or the drawers came to be as opposed to this other project you were working on. And I'm really interested in how you maintain space for surprise in the work. Things like finding those little orange flexible ties that just make sense in the work. But how do you maintain, you have a vision for where you want to go, but you also, it seems like you're quite adaptable and making room for those surprises so that you can respond to them. And I think that's an important idea for people to become familiar with and comfortable with, and it's not always comfortable.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, that's great. I definitely think about the process that I was using at the beginning of entering the University of Oregon and the way that I function now, and that adaptability is really important. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy. Like, when I found these night eyes gear ties, I really was like, oh my God, I love these. Why do I love these? Oh my God, I want to put them on this piece. That looks so different than I expected. Like, the drawing does not make space for these crazy hands. And I love what Robin said. If you look at it from this side, it's like momentum. It's like they're like the exhaust. And I think really just like, I could have just gone for it with the pine boxes, but I wouldn't have liked it. So there's a lot of different things at play there. I made those, I cut this canvas tarp sat underneath a whole dining set that I stripped down and like treated chemically to get like this. So this chair was left over from that project. But it's like, I took this and put it on to these stretchers to make these wall pieces, and I didn't even want to touch them. Like, I didn't want to put anything on them because they were so beautiful to me. But so I guess there's a lot of self-reflection. And I think what's been really difficult, challenging to understand about the way that I make work is that it takes a lot of time, and that a lot of the work doesn't take place like with my hands. It takes place like in my head as I negotiate with myself. Like, I don't know, are we gonna do it this way? I use my phone a ton. Like, I take pictures and look at the images. We're all so used to seeing things like mediated through our phone that really helps me. So I try to talk about being kind to my future self. Like, I try to think like, well, if I'm sitting in this space with the work, what will make me feel really good about the work? I haven't had a moment where my work is like, make me ugly, that I've had to like be like, okay, I'll do it. Because I find the work that I make still like really aesthetically pleasing. So you'll have to ask me again after I make something that I think is ugly, because I know that having to navigate that will feel really different. Yeah. I like your curiosity. I think curiosity is a big part of answering that question too. What will happen if? Yeah.
Cool, hi. So what really piqued my interest in part of this was how you chose to display a lot of this, because it seems like that chair piece right next to you is really personal, the way you talk about it, whereas all the way over here you have something that seems more like you're paying due respect with the way you talk about inheritance and how you didn't want to put the orange into these drawers. So I was wondering, like, what if / what the thought process was and how you position your pieces here.
In sculpture, we talk about like closed forms and open forms. And I really like how this open form and these closed forms really talk to each other and relate to one another. Yeah, when I think about those pieces, I think about like having to do things the hard way, having to get something out that doesn't work anymore. But I also think about, you know, like the way that understanding, like how, let's say like, I can't do this as a parent, this thing my mom did, I'm gonna take it out. It doesn't work for me. But I can understand my mom better if I like am curious instead of judgmental. At one point, I actually did think about putting, there's this twine that is plastic, and it's a darker orange, and our Christmas tree came all bound up in this twine, and so I cut it all off. But it's kind of all together, like the way that I cut it, it didn't end up in a bunch of pieces. I was like, well, what would happen if? And then I really didn't want that orange. I was like, I really want to keep like this really poppy, bright color. So I feel like I only answered part of your question. Yeah, I don't, like those do feel special to me, but they also feel like the concept of a drawer is that there's a mess inside and you can like open it and close it. You can hide things, like it's useful, but also like it can function as a thing that hides things away from you, so.
This chair feels like an intruder. The more you talk, the more I imagine someone between the conversations.
Oh, that's so interesting. I love that feeling. I love that you just told us about that feeling that you were having from that chair. That's great. Also, I had help because I had faced the chair outward. And Robin was like, what do you think about making the chair face this way? And then we moved it, and I was like, oh my God, that's so awesome, because all of the energy is in this space now, and none of it is going necessarily out that way. So I don't know. I don't know if you can practice that feeling of like feeling things. But that's part of it. I like the feeling of the closed forms. Like they're so complete, and they're just so housed inside themselves.
Listening to you talk, I have made a line in the gallery, and I have these two there's a dialogue between these objects. But what I'm seeing over here is, I'm not sure if I see two pairs of objects being the boxes and the pieces on the wall, or if it's two pairs of pieces where each box has the panel on the wall, or if it's the combination of the four together. And even the way that the boxes have the stagger and your panels have the stagger. There's such a beautiful sense of composition between the way the four of those are put together that I don't know if I really have a question here so much as that relationship between the imagery, but also the relationship between the way they're presented makes me feel like that is such a wonderful space. All of those together, even though each piece individually seems to speak pretty confidently on its own, the combination of them is so strong. It's the reason the chair, to me, this terrible blue chair sitting in there was so, if somebody had been sitting on it, it would have been okay. But without somebody sitting on it, it just is, like I said, like an intruder inside of that group. But then the other thing that I see with it is I really do feel as if they are speaking or facing or interacting with the chair on the other side. So how do you feel about that? How do you feel about me sort of seeing all that?
I love it. It's great feedback. Again, like Robin helped me decide to hang the pieces on the wall that way, to kind of mimic them. And that's not like in my home, the way I hang things on the wall, that would never fly. Like I do not love that, but there is an amazing thing that's happening between all four of those things, the way that they're relating to each other. And especially as you walk through the space, that's what this is used for. This space isn't really used to have this conversation like this. So I think that they work together really well. And one of the things that's so tricky about making work, I didn't get to make the work in here. I made it on my desk in my living room. And so then as it all gets brought in here, how it comes together, I knew I wanted them to sit differently. One drawer handle is up, and I knew that I wanted to really point to how the drawer has a face on it and how it's like pushed in, and it's that face that keeps it from going all the way through the piece of furniture. So it's hanging over the edge, and I like that kind of anxiety that it kind of builds, that it might fall off or something. Yeah, I appreciate the comments. I think that they ended up working really well together.
Well, and I'll just jump in and say that the installing, no, it's just me. That the installing of the work, the objects installation becomes, or display becomes, another story.
It's true.
And so that was a getting to know the parameters of the space, but also these relationships in this other storytelling way. And I think that's an important piece when we're making work.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think I could have, the show wouldn't look like this if I had never seen this space. It wouldn't look like this. I don't think it would feel as cohesive over there, right? So.
Does anyone else have comments or questions that you'd like to share? Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I find these conversations, any conversation around art, but particularly with artists, with their work in a space that's intentional, to be so rich and nurturing to all of us as artists. So thank you.
Can I
Melanie?
add one more thing for my class here a little bit? So we have a critique on Wednesday. Melanie's going to be with us for that critique. But I'm going to throw to all of you a question. Do you see the importance of rhythm in her work, our next assignment? Did we pick up on this at all when we came in and took a look a couple weeks ago, and then I gave you the assignment for rhythm, and I encourage you to take a look around rhythm, that repeating forms, but a subtlety and shift between the forms, and how those coming together create a sense of rhythm within the work? I think that it speaks so loudly in here. It's the reason we did the project when we did. I didn't let this out of the bag. I usually do this at the critique, but I'm gonna let it out to you now. So when you're taking a look in here, and again, now that you've got, we've had the experience of coming in here alone and taking a look at the work, just us, now being able to hear the artist speak of the work, but now also think of this idea and how it reflects to your own work and how you're building the projects you're building. I just throw that out there.
Because Andy can't be last. I just actually wanted to say thank you for being here and facilitating with Robin this conversation, because I think it's very interesting to note the change that happens. Like, I've walked through this space dozens of times, but I've never actually sat in it for an hour and gotten to just kind of absorb the energy that is coming off very differently from that side of the room versus this side of the room and their relationship. And that's very interesting. I mean, it's kind of like when you're wandering through the museum and you actually find the piece that you want to kind of park yourself on the bench in front of for a while and get lost in it. And there's an opportunity here as you're speaking about that work to immerse a little bit more deeply into it and to really get into trying to understand exactly what's happening in this space. And it's very different if you inhabit the space for a period of time than if you are transitory in that experience. If you're just walking through, we have one experience, but we actually, I feel like, have a very different experience, and I just appreciate that you were able to come in today and share with us your thoughts and to allow us to have that experience in this space. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Melanie.
Thank you. Thank you all.